popularity bad, what happens to those kids that are deemed popular? Well, those kids that were considered popular in the high status, dominant, controversial way, those hierarchy leaders, is it beneficial? Well, we already talked about how sometimes being the leader might mean you're more aggressive, and we do find that social aggression is tied to popularity. We also find that susceptibility to peer pressure is real, even when you're at the top of the hierarchy. And there might be a lot of pressure to do things like, yeah, you might be getting invited to parties, but you might be pressured into experimenting with substances at an earlier age. And you might have to cut the strings with some of your other friends because you're so high status. People may ask you not to hang out with people who are uncool. Or because you can be so influenced for your behaviors, you have to do a lot more impression management and make sure that you are maintaining your status so rigidly. And there might be more sexual experimentation done by the kids at the top of the hierarchies because of this peer pressure and because they're received as more dominant and more mature. So although they tend to be liked by multiple genders and they tend to fit in with more people and have more power, this power does come at a cost. And speaking about the hierarchies and maintaining power, it's important to understand that whether you are a follower, a sidekick, or a leader in the hierarchy of a clique, you're constantly engaging in status-gaining behaviors. Status-gaining behaviors can come in three flavors. There is establishing. This is when you are either a follower or not even a follower, perhaps you're neglected or rejected, and you're trying to establish your behavior and show, hey, recognize me, I'm worthy hanging out with. An improvement behavior might be happens if you're rejected or if you're lower down, and you want to say, hey, I deserve a little bit more social status than what's going on. And maintaining is the idea that you've reached sort of a good point in your social hierarchy, but you want to make sure nobody's going to push you down. There's wild competition in the pecking order, and you want to make sure you can maintain it. So whether you're establishing, improving, or maintaining, you might do similar behaviors, but you're doing them for slightly different reasons. Some status-gaining behaviors you might see people do is something drastic to change how they're viewed by others. So that may be becoming wildly more athletic or bulking up, changing how they dress, changing their romantic relationship status. Maybe they dump someone who has a lower status than them, or they start dating someone who's a higher status than them, changing their friends. They might also change what they do on the media. They might start posting selfies or using social media very differently. They might experiment with drugs and alcohol. They might purchase or obtain material goods like a new car, and getting access to a car might change their status. It's going to be something that the larger crowd and group views in them and says, wow, look at them, something new has happened. It's not just waking up with a happy attitude. It has to be something more outward that other people will recognize, and then it'll change your status within your clique. So we talked a lot about how these friendship groups can really shift in terms of popularity and how popularity is very dynamic and not static. So we're constantly doing status-gaining behaviors. Some of these status-gaining behaviors can really roll into what we call peer influence. So by peer influence, we're talking about how we learn to do things when we're around our peers. Vicarious learning has a large role in this. And vicarious learning is the idea that you're social modeling, you're watching people, and you're learning some of their tactics. It's the idea that if within one group, within one clique, within one crowd, there might be certain behaviors that are more appropriate and certain behaviors that are not. And if you're a new person to that clique or crowd, you might have to learn what is accepted and what's not. And there's a lot of inside jokes and inside innuendos you might have to get a handle on. Once you do, you find yourself just automatically replaying some of the behaviors. They might have turns of phrases or little abbreviations that make sense to you. Now, the reason why this vicarious learning works so well is we find that if you like someone, you will unconsciously and consciously desire to be similar to them. So if you meet someone who you respect and you think you have similar values, you might be comfortable kind of wearing the same style clothes as them, or doing the same activities as them, or conforming to some of their values and expectations. Versus if you find someone who you dislike, you may unconsciously or consciously try to show how you're very distinct from them. You might really want to show how you're dominant from them and dissimilar from them, and how you have more autonomy. So you want to show how you're going to dress different and act different because you don't like them and you want to show they don't have control over you. So peer influence is something that is different than peer pressure. It's more broad, it's more gentle than pressure, but it's the idea that based on who you want to affiliate with or who you don't want to affiliate with, you will try to be more similar or dissimilar based on where you want to fit in. And that's because of vicarious learning and social modeling. And if you respect someone and like them, you're going to want to model after them. You know, imitation is the finest form of flattery sort of deal here. And so it's important to understand that peer influence can go in multiple ways. As just mentioned, those who are at the top of the hierarchy, they are also susceptible to peer pressure and peer influence. And this is the idea that if you're at the top, you constantly have to do status gaining behaviors. And that's because you have to do a lot more maintenance when you're at the top of a hierarchy than when you're at the bottom. Versus at the bottom, you're going to be doing establishing and improving behaviors. So within a hierarchical clique group, the followers will have to do a lot of status improving behaviors and a lot of mimicry to try and make sure they fit in. But the leaders also do it. If the winds of change move in and sort of there's critical mass that wants something different, the leader's going to have to reciprocate to that, or they're going to be toppled out of their position. And so this is the idea, if you're the odd one out, you might realize, oh, I better change my colors here to fit in with everybody else. So there's a ton of homophily going on this way. This is what really encourages behavioral homophily. It creates bonding. It makes people like you more if you're more similar to them. And also leads to a lot of groupthink, where there's not a lot of anti-conformity within a group unless someone is actively trying to lead a group or to cause a coup or cause a new status. And so because of this, groups are very cohesive and they tend to fit in together, and being in a group can be a very positive experience because you feel your behaviors and your values are validated because it is a bit of an echo chamber. And of course, the last thing we need to talk about is that scary word of peer pressure. And so peer pressure is the idea now that you're not just doing it because you want to be like someone, but your friends or your clique members are telling you to be a certain way. And so pressure is when it's more overt, when people are sort of encouraging you and it's coming from outside yourself. And so pressure, I just want to emphasize here, can come in lots of different ways. We tend to only think about the bad peer pressure, handing a joint, handing a beer to someone and telling them to use substances. And while that is possible, we definitely find there's also good and neutral peer pressure. So what is good peer pressure? Well, good peer pressure is your friends telling you to study, or hey, it's time to go to class, or hey, do you want to volunteer with me for this charitable event on the weekend? Good peer pressure is the types of things that friends do that are adaptive. They help you to respect your family and get good grades. I know we commonly don't think about this when we think about adolescents, but adolescents are highly pro-social, highly agreeable individuals who really want to help the world. And so their friends who have those same values can help them to model those behaviors. Of course, bad peer pressure does exist, and this may be when people are encouraged to experiment sexually before they're ready, or engage in substances before they're ready, or just other things like skipping class, or cheating on an exam, or lending someone the answers for something. There could be shoplifting. We tend to think of all those negative examples, and that does occur. But then we also have the more neutral / trivial peer pressure, and this is something that isn't going to make someone graduate from college, but isn't going to make someone drop out of college. The more trivial or neutral peer pressure is the type that they just tell you what you should order for lunch, or tell you which shoes to wear before you go out on a night on the town. And so this is the idea that there's no major consequences. So you might be at a dance and they say, hey, let's go dance to the song, or hey, let's go get punched now, and you just follow them. That is not really that problematic. It's just sort of benign. And when we look at the prevalences of absolute behaviors that happen, we find that this trivial or neutral peer pressure is by far the most common. These little tiny mundane benign acts that are pretty inconsequential is by far the most common type of peer pressure. And it tends to happen most if you don't really have a reason for why you would say no. So we know that morally kids tend to obey if there is a legal, a school-based, a family-based, or a religious-based rule about something. We tend to obey it. But if there's no rule, whatever, we'll do what our peers say. So the trivial tends to be the most common. And underneath that, the good peer pressure tends to be the most common. And the bad peer pressure is the least common. But what we do see is the bad peer pressure changes the most. And so it really spikes around age 15 or around grade 9. This is also when bullying spikes. This is also when social aggression spikes. And this is also when attachment to the parents weakens the most. So age 15 is a really important milestone on average for lots of kids, because this is when they're detached from their family, the friends mean a lot to them, there's a lot of bullying, a lot of social aggression, and they're more susceptible to that bad peer pressure. And so it is important to recognize that around that time, they may be making bad choices, and there's not a lot the family can do about it because they're putting a lot more weight on their friends than on their parents. That being said, friendship is largely a good thing for us, and I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on friendship. You've now reached the end of Unit 7.